Snow fell like a whisper that morning, slow, steady, unkind. The sky hung low over the plains, the color of old iron, and the wind carried a chill that cut deeper than any knife. A lonely railway station stood against it all, half buried in white, its timbers creaking with every gust. The sign above the platform was barely legible now, Red Willow Station, a name that once meant new beginnings. But not today. Clara Whitmore stood beneath the awning, clutching a small carpetbag to her chest. Her breath came out in soft clouds, and her eyes, though tired, refused to cry anymore. Her husband's train had long gone, the last whistle fading somewhere over the frozen horizon. He had boarded without a word, leaving her on the platform with nothing but the cold in her own trembling hands. For 3 days, she had waited, believing he would return. Maybe he'd changed his mind, maybe he'd send for her, maybe the fight had meant less to him than it did to her. But the telegraph lines stayed silent, and the snow just kept falling. The station master, a gray man with a whiskey nose, had stopped asking if she needed help. Pity was a currency he'd spent long ago. A single lantern burned in the window behind her, its flame flickering like a heartbeat. The world was still, save for the mournful moan of the wind through the telegraph wires. It sounded almost like a voice, the kind that carried both comfort and warning, depending on how lonely you were. By noon, her fingers had gone numb, and the hem of her coat was heavy with ice. She turned once more toward the horizon, hoping against hope for that dark line of smoke that meant salvation. Nothing, only snow and silence. And then, the crunch of boots. Slow, measured, coming from the far side of the tracks. Clara turned. A man was walking through the storm, tall, wrapped in a long brown duster, snow gathering on his hat and shoulders. His horse followed behind, reins looped over the saddle horn, head bowed against the wind. He looked like he'd come from nowhere and carried nowhere with him. When he reached the platform, he stopped a few paces away, removing his hat with a quiet nod. His eyes were gray. The kind of gray that had seen too much and learned to say little. "You waiting for someone, ma'am?" His voice was rough, but not unkind, like gravel over warm earth. Clara swallowed. Her lips were cracked, her voice barely a whisper. "I was." He studied her for a long moment, snow melting in his hair. Then his gaze softened. "Then I reckon they don't deserve you waitin' any longer." She almost smiled, almost. The wind took the sound of his words and carried it into the open plains, where even echoes died slow. The man looked toward the empty horizon, then back at her. "Train won't be back till spring," he said. "You'll freeze out here." "I have nowhere else to go," she murmured. He hesitated, just long enough for her to see the war behind his eyes. Then he stepped forward, holding out a gloved hand. "Then come on," he said quietly. "No one ought to face a winter alone." Clara looked at that hand, strong, calloused, waiting. The hand of a stranger. The hand of a choice. Behind her, the station lantern flickered once and went out. She took his hand. And in that small act, something in the wind changed, as if the land itself had exhaled. The snow deepened as they rode. The wind no longer howled, it sang, threading through the pines like some ancient lament only the land could understand. Clara clung to the saddle behind the stranger, her hands gripping his coat, her cheek pressed against the worn leather. Every breath came out in clouds that disappeared into the storm. He hadn't told her his name yet, and she hadn't asked. Words seemed small against the endless white that swallowed everything in sight, fences, trees, even the horizon itself. All she knew was the steady rhythm of the horse beneath them and the warmth of the man's back in front of her. Now and then, he'd glance over his shoulder to make sure she was still awake. "You holding up back there?" he'd ask, voice half lost to the wind. She'd nod, though her lips were blue. "I'll manage." He gave a short, approving grunt, the sound of a man who respected silence more than sympathy. After an hour, they came to a frozen creek. The man dismounted, boots crunching in the snow, and led the horse across on foot. Clara watched him. The way he tested each step, the quiet certainty of his movements. He wasn't a man running from the world. He was one who had learned to live beside it. When they reached the other side, he helped her down, his hands rough but careful. "We'll stop here a spell," he said. "Let the horse breathe, you too." He pulled a blanket from the saddle and wrapped it around her shoulders. For a moment, His hand brushed hers, a brief, wordless promise that she was safe now, at least for tonight. She sat on a fallen log, watching him work. He struck a match and lit a small fire, shielding it from the wind with his body. The flame caught, licking at the dry bark until the snow around them glowed amber. "You live near?" she asked softly, breaking the quiet. "About 5 miles west," he said. "Old homestead. Used to be my brother's." "Used to be?" He stared into the fire. "He's gone now." She didn't ask how. "You learned, out here, not to pry too deep into other people's ghosts." When she tried to thank him for helping her, he shook his head. "Ain't charity," he said. "It's just what folks oughta do for each other. The world's hard enough without turning cold too." The wind softened for a moment, as if agreeing. Snowflakes drifted through the firelight like falling stars. After they ate a few bites of jerky and hard bread, he finally said, "Name's Eli Holt." "Clara," she answered, her voice quieter than the snow itself. He nodded once. "Nice to meet you, Clara." They rode again soon after, the fire dying behind them, leaving only a thin column of smoke. The storm thickened, erasing their tracks as fast as they made them. But Clara noticed something. She wasn't afraid anymore. Somewhere between the station and the wild, between the cold and the man who'd offered her his hand, the ache in her chest began to ease. By dusk, the clouds broke just enough for her to see a faint orange light ahead, a lantern swinging by a porch. A small cabin stood at the edge of a stand of trees, its roof heavy with snow. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the windows glowed with warmth. Eli reined in the horse and turned to her. "Home," he said simply. The word hit her harder than the wind ever could. For the first time in months, Clara felt what warmth truly meant. The cabin was small, half swallowed by the trees, but its windows glowed like beacons in the snow. When Eli opened the door, a wave of warmth rolled out, firelight and the faint smell of pine smoke. Clara hesitated on the threshold. For so long, every door she'd stepped through had led her deeper into pain. This one, though, felt different. Eli hung his hat by the door and stamped the snow from his boots. "Ain't much," he said, almost apologetic. "But it's dry, and it's warm." To Clara, it was a palace. She moved inside, her shoes sinking into a braided rug. The fire in the stone hearth crackled, painting the walls in flickers of gold. On the mantel stood an old photograph in a cracked frame, a man and a woman, smiling despite the stiffness of the pose. Eli noticed her looking. "My brother, Thomas," he said, "and his wife, Mary. Lost 'em both to fever 2 winters back." "I'm sorry," she whispered. He nodded once, his eyes dark with something deeper than grief. "I kept the place going. Seemed wrong to let it die with them." He busied himself with the stove, pouring water into a kettle. Clara set her bag down, unsure what to do with her hands. She watched him move, deliberate, steady, a man who didn't rush even when the world around him did. "You got anyone waiting for you?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "Not anymore." The words came out flat, but inside they burned. Eli didn't press her. He just poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her. Steam rose between them, soft and ghostly. Outside, the wind clawed at the cabin walls, but in here, time felt slower. The fire hummed. The pine logs popped. Clara's hands, raw from the cold, curled around the mug like it was the last bit of life she had left. "Station master said you'd been there a while," Eli said after a long silence. 3 days. He exhaled through his nose. "That's a hard way to spend a winter." She met his eyes across the firelight, gray to brown. "It's harder to spend it waiting for someone who's never coming back." He looked away then, jaw tightening. She thought maybe she'd said too much, until he murmured, "I know that feeling." The wind moaned outside like a restless ghost. Eli got up, took a thick blanket from a trunk, and draped it over her shoulders without a word. His touch was brief, almost cautious. "You can have the bed," he said. "I'll take the chair." "I can't." He stopped her with a look that wasn't stern, just sure. "You've done enough freezing for one day." She wanted to argue, but the truth was she could barely keep her eyes open. So she let herself rest, the blanket heavy and kind around her shoulders. Before sleep claimed her, she saw him sit by the fire, elbows on his knees, staring into the flames like a man searching for something he'd lost years ago. She didn't know then that Eli Holt carried his own ghosts, ones that waited outside that cabin in the snow, patient as the night itself. By morning, the storm had quieted, but the world outside was buried in white. The forest stood still beneath the weight of it, every pine branch heavy with snow, every sound muffled like the earth itself was holding its breath. Clara woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of wood crackling. Eli was already up, stoking the fire, his shoulders outlined by the soft morning light leaking through the window. He turned when she stirred. "You sleep all right?" She nodded, sitting up slowly. The blanket had slipped from her shoulders, but its warmth still clung to her like a memory. "I did, better than I have in months." "Good," he said simply. "There's bread and jam on the table. Ain't much, but it'll start the day." She smiled faintly. "It's perfect." They ate in silence, the only sound the soft hiss of the fire. Outside, a few flakes drifted down again, gentle now, harmless. But Eli kept glancing toward the window, as if listening for something beyond the trees. Clara noticed it. "You expecting someone?" He hesitated. "Not expecting. Just remembering." She waited. He leaned back in his chair, gaze fixed on the flames. "Couple winters back, there was trouble out here. Bandits, mostly. Folks running from the law, looking for shelter. They took what they wanted, food, horses, sometimes worse. I helped the sheriff chase him off, but not before they made it personal." She studied his face, the scar near his jaw, the tightness in his eyes when he spoke. "They hurt someone?" He nodded once. "My brother and his wife. They never got the men responsible. Last I heard, the leader, name's Pike, was still out there, heading north." Her stomach tightened. "And you think he might come back?" Eli shrugged. "Men like him don't forget who stands in their way. And I reckon he don't forgive neither." Silence fell again. The wind whistled faintly through the cracks in the shutters, and Clara pulled her shawl tighter. Eli stood, poured another cup of coffee, and changed the subject. "I'll have to ride into town tomorrow. Check if the roads are open. You'll be safe here while I'm gone." But Clara's heart quickened. The thought of being alone in this cabin, with ghosts of the past prowling in the woods, chilled her deeper than the snow outside. "Let me come with you," she said softly. He turned to her, surprised. "You don't even have boots for this weather." "Then lend me some." She met his gaze, steady and sure. "I've been left behind enough times, Mr. Holt. I don't aim to be left again." He studied her for a moment, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. Respect, maybe. Then he nodded. "All right, but stay close." That afternoon, the two of them walked the edge of the property, checking fences buried in snow and chopping wood for the next few nights. Clara tried to keep pace, but Eli's stride was long and sure. Still, he slowed when he saw her falter, handing her his gloves when hers tore. For a man of few words, he had a way of showing care without ever naming it. By dusk, the sky burned pink behind the mountains. Smoke curled from the chimney, a thin thread against the fading light. They just stacked the last of the logs when Eli stopped suddenly, his eyes narrowing toward the tree line. "What is it?" Clara whispered. He raised a hand. "Quiet." Somewhere beyond the pines, a faint echo, the soft, distant snort of a horse. Then another. Clara's pulse quickened. Eli's voice dropped to a murmur. "No traveler rides this far north in a storm unless he's got reason." He led her back toward the cabin, slow but urgent. Once inside, he closed the shutters, dimmed the lanterns, and went to a chest near the door. From it, he pulled a rifle, old but well kept. Clara stood by the hearth, her hands trembling. "Is it them?" "I don't know," he said, loading the gun. "But whoever it is, they don't need to see light in the window tonight." The fire burned lower, throwing long shadows across the walls. Outside, hooves crunched softly over snow. Then, silence. Eli stood by the window, listening. Clara could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Minutes passed. The sound faded. The woods went still again. He set the rifle down, but his jaw was tight. "We'll keep watch tonight," he said. Clara nodded, her fear giving way to something else, a strange, quiet trust. She knew danger when she saw it, and she knew men who'd walked away from it to save themselves. But Eli Holt didn't strike her as that kind of man. That night, as the storm returned and the cabin creaked under its weight, she sat near the fire, watching his silhouette in the dim light. A man standing between her and a world that had already tried to break her once. She didn't know why he'd taken her hand at the station, or why he'd chosen to bring her here. But as the wind howled outside, she began to feel that maybe fate hadn't been cruel after all. Maybe it had just been waiting. Morning came pale and silent. The storm had stopped, leaving behind a world washed white and still. The trees glistened with frost, the air sharp enough to bite. Clara stirred from uneasy sleep, still wrapped in the blanket Eli had thrown over her in the night. The fire was low, but warm enough to keep the cabin from freezing. Eli was already by the window, his rifle resting against the wall, eyes scanning the tree line again. He hadn't slept. "See anything?" she asked quietly. He shook his head. "Not a soul, but tracks." Her heart skipped. "Human? Maybe, could be deer, could be horses, but they're fresh, from last night." He picked up his coat and gloves. "I'm going to take a look." "Stay inside. Bolt the door." She stood, clutching the edge of her shawl. "You shouldn't go alone." "I won't go far." But she heard the tone in his voice, not a promise, just reassurance. He was already halfway out the door before she could answer. The wind rushed in, cold and cruel, then was gone. She bolted the door and pressed her ear to the wood, listening to the crunch of his boots fade into the distance. Minutes passed, then an hour. The cabin seemed to shrink around her. Every creak of wood, every sigh of wind felt louder, closer. She tried to keep busy, stoking the fire, cleaning the table, folding the blankets. But when she glanced at the window, she thought she saw something move between the pines, a shape, dark against the snow. Her breath caught. "Eli," she whispered, even though she knew it wasn't him. She reached for the poker near the hearth, her fingers trembling. The shape didn't move for several seconds, then shifted, slow, deliberate. And then came a knock. Soft at first, then again. 3 times. Clara froze. The sound was too light to be Eli's heavy hand, too calm to be desperate. It was, "Careful." Her voice shook. "Who's there?" Silence. Another knock. She stepped closer to the door, keeping the poker raised. "Mr. Holt's not here. You best move on." Still no reply. Then, faintly, a man's voice, rough but tired. "Ma'am, I mean no harm. Just need a bit of shelter. Been riding all night." Clara hesitated, her pulse thudded in her ears. "Please," the voice added, weaker now. "I'm freezing out here." She thought of Eli's warning, of the bandits he'd mentioned, the men who'd once left bodies in the snow. But she also remembered another night not long ago, when she had been the one left out in the cold, praying someone would open a door. After a long breath, she unbolted the door halfway. A man stood there, hunched and shaking, his beard frosted, his eyes sunken with exhaustion. His horse, tied behind him, was barely standing. "Thank you," he rasped, stepping into the light. Clara hesitated, then shut the door behind him, bolting it again. "You can warm yourself by the fire. There's water on the stove." He nodded, moving closer, rubbing his hands together. "Much obliged, ma'am." She poured him a tin cup of water, watching him. His clothes were ragged, torn at the shoulder. A faint scar ran down his cheek. After a few sips, he glanced around. "This Holt fellow, he live here long?" Her heart skipped. "Why do you ask?" He smiled faintly. "Name sounds familiar. Used to ride with a man named Holt, long time ago. Out near Reading. Big fella, good shot." Clara forced herself to stay calm. "He's outside right now, checking the fences." The stranger nodded, staring into the fire. "Then I reckon I'll thank him myself when he's back." She nodded but didn't look away. Every instinct told her something was wrong. His tone was too smooth. His smile too practiced. Outside, she heard the faint cry of a crow, 1, then 2. Eli had taught her that sound the day before. It meant danger. Her grip on the poker tightened. The stranger noticed. "Easy, ma'am," he said softly. "Ain't looking for trouble, just trying to thaw my bones." But she saw the shape of something beneath his coat, metal. A revolver. Then came the sound of boots on snow, steady, certain. "Eli." The stranger turned toward the door, his hand twitching near his hip. The door opened, and cold wind swept through as Eli stepped in. His rifle was already in his hands. "Step away from her," he said quietly. The man smiled, slow, cruel. "I'll be damned, Eli Holt. Should have known you'd still be holed up in this frozen end of nowhere." Eli's voice was low. "Pike." Clara's blood ran cold. The stranger, the one who'd asked for shelter, was the very man Eli had warned her about. "Been a long time," Pike drawled, stepping back, one hand still resting on his coat. "Didn't figure you'd be playing house. She yours?" Eli's eyes darkened. "You don't speak her name." Pike laughed. "So you did start a new life. Good for you, Holt. Shame it won't last long." Before Clara could react, the air between them seemed to thicken, years of hate tightening like a noose. Pike's hand moved. Eli's rifle lifted. The cabin erupted with the sound of gunfire. And outside, the wind howled again, as if the mountain itself remembered all the ghosts buried beneath its snow. The echo of the gunshot hung in the cabin long after the sound had faded. Clara couldn't move. Her hands were still clamped around the iron poker, her knuckles white. Outside, snow drifted softly against the windowpane, like nothing had happened, like the world had simply swallowed the noise. When she finally looked up, Eli was standing by the door, his breath ragged, rifle still aimed at the figure sprawled on the wooden floor. Pike lay motionless, a dark stain spreading slowly beneath him, melting the snow that had clung to his coat. Eli lowered his gun, his eyes hard but empty. "You all right?" he asked quietly, turning toward her. Clara nodded, though her voice refused to come. He crossed the room in 2 steps and gently took the poker from her hand. "It's over," he said, though the words sounded hollow, like he didn't believe them. She sank to her knees beside the hearth, staring into the flames. Who was he? Eli hesitated. Then, after a long breath, he said, "A man from before. From a time I'd hoped to bury." She turned to look at him. His face was pale, the lines deeper now. "I did things I ain't proud of," he said softly. "Rode with Pike once. We worked for whoever had the gold to pay. Thought the West was a place to get rich quick, until it took everything from me." Clara said nothing. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Eli's voice dropped lower. "He wasn't supposed to find me here." "Then why did he come?" she asked. Eli knelt, picking up Pike's revolver from the floor. "Because men like him don't let ghosts rest. He came to settle what he thought I owed." Clara's gaze drifted to the window. Snow had begun to fall again, quiet and heavy. "We can't stay," she said softly. Eli nodded. "I know. The noise will draw others. Maybe riders from town, maybe Pike's kind." He dragged the body outside, boots crunching in the snow. Clara followed, clutching her shawl tight. The morning light was pale, the sky bruised with gray. Together, they dug a shallow grave behind the cabin, the earth frozen, their breath visible in the air. When it was done, Eli stood for a long while, staring at the mound. "He was a wicked man," he murmured, "but once, we shared the same hunger. I reckon that's what frightens me most." Clara looked at him then, really looked. Not as the quiet man who had saved her at the station, but as someone who carried his own scars, his own ghosts. She touched his arm. "Everyone has something to atone for, Mr. Holt. Even those of us who never meant harm." He glanced at her, a faint, weary smile tugging at his lips. "You think there's forgiveness left for folk like us?" She held his gaze. "If the snow can cover the ground every winter, maybe it can cover our pasts too." He looked away, blinking against the wind. "You talk like a preacher." "I talk like someone who's seen what cruelty can do, and what kindness can mend." For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the faint scent of smoke and cold pine sap. Then Eli picked up his saddlebag and rifle. "We'll head east," he said finally. "There's an old trail through the valley. Should take us near Willow Creek. You can find shelter there. Maybe even work." Clara frowned. "And you?" "I'll ride as far as I can," he said simply. "Men like me aren't built to stay." The words stung more than she wanted to admit. "You think I'd still be breathing if not for you?" she said quietly. "You pulled me out of the snow once. Don't leave me to it again." Eli stopped mid-step. The silence between them grew heavy. Then, softly, he said, "Clara, I ain't good company. I've buried too many promises I couldn't keep." "Then make one you can," she said, He turned to her, really turned, and for a heartbeat, she saw something break in his eyes. The wall of guilt, of self-loathing, cracked just enough for the man beneath to breathe. He exhaled, the cloud of his breath fading into the white morning. "All right," he said finally. "We ride together." She smiled, though tears stung her eyes. Together, they packed what little they had: bread, matches, blankets, his mother's Bible, her locket. Before leaving, Clara turned back one last time. The cabin stood quiet, a thin trail of smoke curling from the chimney. Ashes in the snow. She whispered a silent prayer for what they were leaving behind, and for whatever waited beyond the valley. As they rode away, the snow began to fall heavier, soft flakes melting against their coats. Two silhouettes moved slowly through the white, their shapes fading into the endless horizon. And though the cold bit hard, something warm had begun to stir, not from the fire, but from the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, the worst was behind them. The valley stretched out like a frozen sea, white and endless under a sky bruised with storm clouds. The wind had quieted some, but its breath still haunted the air, whispering through the pines, sighing across the drifts. Eli and Clara rode side by side, wrapped in blankets, their horses pushing through the deepening snow. Every hoofbeat sounded muffled, swallowed by the winter silence. They hadn't spoken much since leaving the cabin. Words seemed small against the vastness around them. Clara kept her gaze on the horizon, where the faint outline of distant cliffs rose like sleeping giants. "How much farther?" she finally asked, her voice trembling more from cold than fear. Eli adjusted his hat against the glare. "Another mile or two. There's a ridge that'll give us cover. Once we're over it, the trail opens toward Willow Creek." Clara nodded, though her eyes were drawn to the faint mist curling through the trees. "Feels like the whole land's holding its breath." He gave a small grunt. "That's winter for you. The world gets quiet before it decides who it'll keep." They rode in silence again. A hawk circled high above, its cry distant and lonely. Snowflakes clung to Clara's lashes, melting into tears she didn't bother to wipe away. When the ridge finally came into view, they dismounted and led the horses upward. The climb was steep, the snow thick, but Eli moved with steady purpose, a man who'd crossed many such places before. Clara followed, each step a small victory against the cold biting her skin. Halfway up, the wind shifted, sudden, sharp. Eli stopped, lifting a gloved hand. "Hear that?" At first she didn't. Then, faintly, came a sound, a whistle, low and eerie, carrying through the trees. "Wind?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, not wind. Someone's out there." The horses snorted, uneasy. Clara's heart thudded. "Do you think it's—" "Could be travelers," Eli said, though his hand was already near his revolver. "Could be worse." They pressed on, slower now. The sound came again, closer, clearer. It wasn't a whistle this time. It was singing. A man's voice, rough and tuneless, drifting through the snow like a ghost. Eli's jaw tightened. "Stay close," he murmured. They crested the ridge and saw it. A small fire burning weakly below, half hidden by fallen pines. A man sat beside it, wrapped in a torn coat, his hat pulled low. Clara's instinct was to call out, but Eli held her back. "Wait." He studied the figure for a moment, then motioned for her to stay with the horses. "I'll go first." She wanted to protest, but the look in his eyes stopped her. Eli descended carefully, rifle in hand. The man by the fire didn't move until Eli was nearly 10 paces away. Then he lifted his head. "Don't shoot, friend," he said hoarsely. "Ain't got much left to steal." Eli's grip on the rifle eased slightly. "Then you best start talking. This valley doesn't see many folk in winter." The man chuckled weakly. "Didn't plan to be here long. Got turned around after the storm. Lost my horse 2 days back. Thought I'd freeze before morning." Eli studied him. The man's face was gaunt, eyes sunken, beard stiff with frost. There was no weapon in sight, just a bundle of firewood and a canteen. "Got a name?" Eli asked. "Jonas," the man said. "Jonas Reed." Eli's brow furrowed. "You from Reading?" The man looked up sharply. "Was. Years ago. You know it?" Eli nodded slowly. "Used to." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Eli glanced back toward Clara. "Got someone with me," he said finally. We're headed east. You can follow if you've got the strength. Jonas smiled faintly. East sounds as good as any direction. Eli helped him to his feet and led him back up the ridge. When Clara saw them, she hurried forward, worry written on her face. Another lost soul, Eli said quietly. We'll take him as far as Willow Creek. Clara nodded, offering her blanket. You look half dead, she said gently. Jonas laughed, though it came out as a cough. Feels about right, ma'am. They set out again, the three of them moving slowly through the valley. The snow fell thicker now, turning the air into a curtain of white. As night came, they found a hollow beneath the cliffs and made camp. Eli built a fire, and the flickering light painted their faces in gold and shadow. Jonas stared into the flames. You folks married? He asked suddenly. Clara glanced at Eli, who shook his head. No, she said softly. Just traveling together. Jonas nodded, though a faint smirk crossed his face. Could have fooled me, the way you look at him. Like you're waiting on something he's afraid to give. Eli's eyes flicked up, cold and unreadable. You talk too much for a man half frozen. Jonas chuckled. Fair enough. He poked at the fire with a stick, the embers glowing red. You've both got ghosts chasing you, don't you? I can see it in your eyes. This valley, it's full of them. They say the wind here carries the last words of the ones who never made it out. Clara shivered, though not from cold. That's just superstition. Maybe, Jonas murmured, but maybe not. I've heard them myself. Voices whispering, your name when the storm comes. Eli looked up sharply. Whose name? Jonas's gaze met his, and for a heartbeat, something strange passed between them, recognition or warning. Then the wind howled through the cliffs, carrying with it a faint sound, something that almost sounded like a woman crying. Clara turned toward the darkness, her heart pounding. Eli, she whispered, did you hear that? He didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the shadows beyond the firelight. And the valley of whispers, held its breath once more. The fire burned low, crackling against the hush of the night. The snow outside had slowed to a quiet drift, but the wind still whispered through the trees, low, sorrowful, like a prayer for the lost. Clara sat close to the flames, her shawl pulled tight, watching the light dance across Eli's face. He hadn't spoken since the strange cry had echoed through the valley. His gaze was fixed beyond the firelight, toward the dark ridge. Jonas sat opposite, silent for once, his expression unreadable. Every now and then, his eyes flicked to Eli, as if measuring something invisible between them. Finally, Clara broke the silence. What was that sound? Eli stirred. Could have been the wind. It wasn't the wind, she said softly. I've lived enough winters to know its voice. That was something else. Eli didn't respond. His hand rested on the rifle beside him, the leather of his glove creaking faintly. Jonas poked at the fire, his tone slow and deliberate. You ever lose someone out here, Holt? Eli's jaw tightened. Everyone's lost someone out here. That's not what I asked, Jonas said quietly. Eli looked up, his eyes sharp. What are you getting at, Reed? Jonas shrugged, still watching the fire. Just that places like this remember. Snow keeps secrets, sure, but the wind, she never forgets. I've seen it, heard it. The ones we buried too shallow don't stay quiet. Clara frowned. That's nonsense. Jonas looked at her. You think so? You ever been where the snow hums like a voice, where the ground itself sighs when you walk it? She swallowed, uneasy now. You talk like a preacher of ghosts. Jonas gave a dry smile. Maybe I am. Maybe I'm just a man who's seen too much death. Eli's voice cut through, low and firm. Enough. We'll move at first light. Jonas nodded but didn't look away. Whatever you say, Holt. The silence returned, broken only by the pop of the fire. But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen was circling them. Not flesh, not beast, but memory. Hours passed. Jonas fell asleep first, snoring softly beneath his blanket. Clara tried to rest but kept her eyes half open, the shadows of the flames shifting across Eli's worn face. He looked older in that light, like the years of solitude and guilt were carved into his skin. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Who was she? He blinked, slow. Who? The woman whose voice you thought you heard. He hesitated. The flames crackled between them, Then, quietly, he said, her name was Nora. Clara waited. We were married, he said finally. Years ago. Before the guns, before Pike and the others. She used to sing by the fire when the wind got mean. Said it kept the spirits from finding their way inside. What happened to her? Clara asked gently. Eli's jaw clenched. I left her behind. The words were raw, like he hadn't spoken them aloud in years. We were living up near the border. I took a job that went wrong, men died, and I came back to find our cabin burned. They said raiders, but I knew better. Pike had been there. I found her shawl by the river. He looked at the fire, his eyes distant. I buried what I could find. Never saw her again. Clara's throat tightened. And now you think? I don't know what I think, he said. But ever since that night, every time the wind turns cold, I swear I hear her voice. Outside, the storm moaned again, low and hollow. The sound was faint, but unmistakable, like someone calling from far away. Clara's blood ran cold. Eli, she whispered. He didn't look up. His eyes were wet now, though the firelight hid the tears. It's her, he said softly. It's Nora. Clara reached for him, her hand trembling. You can't know that. But even as she spoke, a shadow moved beyond the firelight, a pale figure drifting between the trees, almost invisible against the snow. Clara gasped. There. Eli rose in an instant, rifle in hand. Stay back. He stepped forward slowly, eyes fixed on the white silhouette. It moved like mist, the folds of its dress fluttering without wind. Eli, the voice was faint, like breath on glass. He froze. His name. Carried on the wind, gentle and broken. Clara clutched the blanket to her chest, her heart racing. Eli, come back, it's not real. But he didn't stop. He moved closer, drawn like a moth to the cold light. The figure stood at the edge of the trees now, clear enough for him to see her face. Pale, fragile, eyes full of sorrow. Nora, he whispered. The voice came again. You left me? His rifle slipped from his grasp, falling softly into the snow. I didn't know, he whispered. God help me, I didn't know. The figure tilted its head, almost tender, almost forgiving, then began to fade, dissolving into the falling snow. Wait, Eli cried, stumbling forward. But the wind rose, fierce now, wrapping around him, pushing him back. Eli, Clara shouted, running to his side, pulling him away from the white blur of the storm. The snow swallowed the world around them, the fire's light barely visible behind the veil of wind. And through it all, faint and mournful, came a whisper that neither of them would ever forget. Not yet. By morning, the storm had passed. The snow lay deep and white, untouched except for a single set of footprints that stopped at the tree line, Eli's. Clara woke to find him already outside, standing where the figure had vanished. His breath rose in thin clouds against the pale dawn. For a moment, she simply watched him through the cabin's frosted window, a lone man in a white world, still caught between the living and the dead. When she stepped outside, the cold bit her skin like a warning. She wrapped her shawl tighter and joined him in silence. The air smelled of pine and smoke. No birds, no sound at all. Eli didn't turn. She was here. Clara's voice came soft. I saw her too. He nodded slowly. You believe it then? I believe something wants you to let go. He let out a bitter laugh. Let go? Of what? The past? The guilt? You don't let go of ghosts, Clara. They let go of you when they're ready. She studied him, his shoulders heavy beneath the wool coat, his hands trembling just slightly. And if she wasn't angry? He frowned. What do you mean? What if she wasn't calling for revenge? Clara said, her voice steady now, but forgiveness. Eli's jaw tightened. Forgiveness doesn't bring back the dead. No, she said quietly. But it brings back the living. Her words lingered in the cold like smoke. He looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time since she'd met him, his eyes softened. You talk like someone who's done forgiving. Clara smiled sadly. I've had practice. They stood there in the stillness, the snow glittering like crushed glass around their boots. Then Eli turned, his voice lower. There's a place I buried her. I think I need to see it again. Clara nodded. Then I'm coming with you. He hesitated, but didn't argue. Together, they packed their things and set out north, following the narrow trail through the frozen valley. Jonas rode ahead in silence, his face grim but curious. The road wound between cliffs and bare trees, the silence broken only by the crunch of hooves and the creak of leather. Above them, the sky turned pale silver, winter's heart. By midday, they reached the ridge. The cabin below had long since fallen apart, only the stone chimney left standing like a grave marker. Eli dismounted slowly, his boots sinking into the snow. He walked to the chimney, knelt, and brushed away the frost. Beneath it, half buried, was a small wooden cross. Nora Holt. That's all it said. Clara stood beside him, her heart heavy. Eli's voice trembled. I came back once before. Tried to say something, but I couldn't. He set down his gloves, his hand tracing the letters. I thought leaving would save her. I thought the world was too cruel for a woman like Nora. But I was wrong. I brought the cruelty with me. Clara knelt beside him. You did what you thought you had to. Eli shook his head. I left her alone. Then don't leave her again, Clara whispered. Not in your heart. He closed his eyes. For a long while, there was only the sound of the wind moving through the ruins. Then, in a voice barely louder than a breath, he said, I'm sorry, Nora. For every step I took away from you. The wind rose suddenly, a soft gust that swept the snow from the cross. And for a moment, Clara swore she saw something shimmer in the light, a pale outline, smiling faintly before dissolving into air. Eli's breath caught. His hand reached out, but the vision was gone. Still, something inside him shifted, not vanished, but eased. When he looked at Clara, his eyes were clear, though wet with tears. She heard me. Clara nodded. Yes, she did. He stood then, his voice steady for the first time. We should go. There's nothing left here but peace. They mounted their horses, the wind trailing softly behind them. As they rode away, the clouds broke open, letting thin rays of sunlight spill across the snow. Halfway down the trail, Eli glanced back one last time, and for a heartbeat, he thought he saw her standing at the ridge. Not haunting, just watching. He tipped his hat. Goodbye, Nora. Then he rode on. By dusk, they reached the edge of the valley. Jonas lit the campfire while Clara unpacked their food. Eli sat a little apart, staring into the flames, the weight that had shadowed him for years finally beginning to lift. Clara watched him quietly, feeling something unfamiliar bloom in her chest, not just sympathy, but connection. She had known grief too, though she had never spoken it aloud. And now, beside this man who'd carried his sorrow through snow and silence, she felt less alone. As the fire crackled, Eli looked up. Thank you. For what? She asked. For staying, he said simply. For reminding me the living still matter. Clara smiled, small and tired but warm. You did the same for me. The night deepened around them, the storm long gone. Somewhere, far off, a wolf howled, not mournful, but alive. And under the vast, quiet sky, two souls who had both been left behind began to find their way forward. The snow began to melt in March. Slowly, quietly, the way all healing begins. At first it was only drops from the eaves, small trickles through the ice. Then puddles spread across the valley floor, revealing the brown earth beneath. Each morning, Clara woke to the sound of dripping instead of silence. It was the sound of the world thawing, the sound of something long frozen coming back to life. The cabin that had once felt like a refuge now felt like a home. The rough-hewn walls no longer echoed with emptiness. They carried the warmth of shared breath, soft laughter, and the rustle of coffee on the stove. Jonas had ridden out to town 2 weeks earlier, leaving them supplies and a promise to return when the trails cleared. It was just Eli and Clara now, two souls who had weathered the storm and found each other in its quiet aftermath. Clara stood at the window, watching the sun bleed gold across the hills. The snow still clung to the shadows, but patches of earth were showing through. She pressed her hand to the glass and smiled faintly. Eli stepped up behind her. He was silent for a moment, then said softly, Never thought I'd see this land green again. She turned. You've seen it before? He nodded. Once. Long time ago. It was spring then, too. I thought it would never come back. It always does, Clara said. Just takes time. Eli looked at her then, not the way a man studies a stranger, but as one might study a sunrise, afraid to blink and miss it. You talk like someone who believes in second chances. I do, she said quietly. Because someone gave me mine. He smiled, a tired but honest thing. Guess I'm learning to take mine too. Outside, the wind had softened, no longer the howling of winter, but a low hum that carried the smell of pine and thawed soil. Eli opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. Clara followed, wrapping her shawl tight. They stood side by side as the sun rose higher, the light catching the frost still clinging to the rails. For a long while, neither spoke. There was no need. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was peace. Eli finally broke it. You ever think about leaving? About going somewhere new? Clara's eyes followed a hawk circling above the ridge. I used to. Thought if I could just run far enough, I'd forget everything behind me. And now? She looked at him, the corner of her mouth lifting. Now I think some places ain't meant to be escaped. They're meant to be rebuilt. Eli chuckled softly. You got a way of making things sound easy. It's not easy, she said. But it's worth it. He nodded, the quiet understanding between them deeper than words. After a while, Eli went to fetch the horses. The snow had melted enough for them to ride beyond the valley, to see what the world looked like beyond their small circle of survival. Clara saddled her mare with steady hands, her heart lighter than it had been in months. They rode without hurry, their breath misting in the cool morning air. The landscape that had once been a wasteland of white now glimmered with the first green buds of life. Streams ran where ice had been. The sound of birds returned to the air, cautious, tentative, as if testing the sky for kindness again. Eli stopped by a ridge and dismounted. Clara followed, stepping down beside him. Below, the land stretched wide and open, a patchwork of snow and soil, promise and memory. He looked out, voice low. Didn't think there'd be a tomorrow worth looking at. Clara laid a hand on his arm. Then it's a good thing you stayed long enough to see it. He turned toward her, eyes softer than she'd ever seen. Clara, I. She shook her head gently, her breath catching in the cold air. You don't have to say it. I know. But he said it anyway. Thank you. For giving me back the part of me I thought was gone. The wind rose between them, carrying the faint smell of spring grass. Clara smiled. Then don't waste it, Eli. Live like you mean it. He reached out then, taking her gloved hand in his, rough, calloused fingers meeting warmth. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then, quietly, he said, You stayin'? Clara looked toward the horizon, where the sun met the snow, where endings became beginnings. If you'll have me. Eli nodded once. Reckon I'd be a fool not to. And for the first time in years, he laughed. Not the short, guarded laugh of a man used to loss, but something freer, lighter. Clara laughed too, the sound joining his, carried off by the wind across the awakening valley. The thaw had come. Later that evening, as the stars rose over the melting snow, Eli sat on the porch carving a small wooden shape, a figure of a woman holding a lantern. When he finished, he set it on the railing. For Nora, he murmured. And for what comes after. Clara came out then, holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one and sat beside him. Together, they watched the stars. Eli spoke quietly. Think spring's really here? Clara smiled, leaning against his shoulder. It's already started. And so it had, not in the land, but in them.